Hello and welcome to this video asking the question, do you get more ethanol from distilling a little or a lot of alcohol at one time? If you distill alcohol, you may have thought that it's better to do more at once. This is for rather obvious reasons related to efficiency. You can distill one batch of alcohol and get a consistent result, no further work is needed. Or, in other cases, it's rather more easy to pour it all into your still once and have it done with, rather than having to wait, distill one batch, let the system cool, and then distill another. The question then is, does this really benefit you in the end? To that end, we ran a simple but straightforward experiment of 4 distillations. These range from 1 litre to 20 litres. This is compared to the theoretical yield for the same volume and concentration of sugar. Then, how much of each volume actually made it out of the still, not just by itself, but relative to 1 single litre. That way everything can be compared as a similar sort of scenario. No apples versus oranges. Each run was heated until it got to 77 degrees Celsius. Then the water was allowed to flow through the system. The valve was opened and the distillation allowed to go until it reached 90 degrees Celsius. This should extract up to 90% of the ethanol, but more why we chose this last point shortly. Having said that, the results are both predictable and kind of weird. Before we do get to the results though, we need to mention a few important factors. 1. The upper limit for a column still is 95% of the ethanol. That is, we cannot extract the last 5% of ethanol from the wash, no matter what we do. This is down to the water-ethanol mix being azeotropic. A video for that is in the top corner now. The Cliff Notes version of that is that as the water concentration goes up and the ethanol goes down, it is harder to get the ethanol out. Because of this, we set a temperature threshold of 90 degrees Celsius. This should correspond to distilling 90% of the ethanol out of the water. The other points are that there are several distillations that were run. The results you see are the averages of these runs. This should allow us to remove any variation between different batches for whatever reason. Finally, everything was measured in a small tube for alcohol concentration and standardized. In the smallest distillation, this means adding more water to meet the minimum volume, but this was corrected for. In the same vein, temperature corrections were made for the alcohol by volume measured. With that in mind, the results start off fairly straightforward when we talk about yield alone. It goes from 20 milliliters in the first liter, which is considerably lower than we would have hoped. In fact, a lot low. It should be 200 milliliters, let's be clear about this, given that the yeast should make 20% alcohol by volume. That of course has assumed ideal conditions, distillation, etc. This is demonstrated at 5 litres where we get an increasing amount. It's 400 milliliters or 0.4 litres. At 10 litres it rises to 1.8 litres, and finally 3.8 litres at 95% alcohol from a 20 litre wash. This line is not necessarily linear, but we wouldn't expect it to be. After all, we're not increasing by 1 litre at a time. We're doing set time points, or in this case volume. In short, a bigger wash, more ethanol was produced. Okay, this shouldn't be a surprise. Certainly, it's what conventional wisdom will tell you to do. The key for us is not the wash size as such, but the yield from the original wash volume. That is, if you are going to distill a small 1 litre amount, are you better off doing that than getting 20 litres at one time? Again, we can chart this, and what you see is the amount you get from the wash as you distill it per litre. To be clear about it, this is a litre of wash that's been put into the still. In an obvious way, there is a shortcoming with too small an amount. You can see that here, and it's shown with distilling just 1 litre. You get nearly nothing worth the trouble and time. However, as things go up, the yield rises per litre. This is consistent with the azeotropic effect. While it is nearly always capped at 95% ethanol, the yield of 95% isn't necessarily what you would expect. That is because 5% in a 20 litre wash is equivalent to 100 milliliters of ethanol that you've lost. But 5% in 1 litre is only 5 milliliters. Although the wash holds onto 100 milliliters in a 20 litre wash, you get the remaining amount, at least in theory. In practice, the yeast produces 25% by volume of alcohol in the entire of the wash. So in theory, this should be 4 liters of pure ethanol, 100% ethanol. Remembering though that we can only get 95% out of it. So these 4 liters of pure ethanol means we can only get 3.8 liters, or 95% of this exactly. And taking this idea and working backwards, 20% of 10 liters is 2 liters, and we get 1.8 liters. This means we've only lost a small amount, but we have about 90% of the yield. So we have made a small loss. At 5 liters, we had 1 liter of ethanol, in theory anyway, but in practice we got 0.4 liters, and well, it shows you that there's a rather large gap here. And you can see that there is a general trend, a big difference between what we should get and what we did get. On this basis, it's reasonable to say that between 10 and 20 liters is ideal, although then again, if you were to distill more than 20 liters, it's arguably the case that you could get even more again. If you're going to distill less than 5 liters, you're really making a net loss, as your losses are going to be more than 50% of the ethanol. We should point out that this entire experiment did ignore a few major points, particularly with regards to efficiency, and that is the energy needed not only to heat the distillation boiler, but the water to cool it as well. And this can be a major feature for what you're going to choose. Arguably, the smaller the wash, the less water you need to cool it, and to a certain extent, the less energy needed to heat the wash itself. But there's also the fact that the boiler has a certain heat capacity, and that heat capacity has to be met before your ethanol wash starts to be heated. And this is always present. So arguably in that case, one big batch is actually more energy efficient than a series of smaller distillations is. That's because each small distillation has to heat the entirety of the boiler and then the ethanol. Whereas if you're going to do one large wash and then distill one large distillation, you only need to heat it once. But the same thing with the water to cool it. Unless you're recycling the water, and this is one of the slightly more challenging aspects given the water gets heated as it goes through the still, you need to be aware of the fact that it will gradually use more water the longer the distillation goes on. That's why we only turn the water on once we set a certain threshold and met that threshold. Before that, the water doesn't really do anything, it's just wasted. This is one of those efficiency issues. But then again, as we've come to in the end, overall, the larger the distillation volume, the more efficient it is, to a point anyway. And overall, hopefully this shows you how much better distilling is, in not just practical, but efficiency terms. One big distillation, generally better than many small ones, but this is in terms of a column still. A pot still is a different matter entirely that we'll get to one day. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.